I've been very interested in looking at, in the last, couple of years, the way the Old Testament teaches us. I've had the impression that some people think that the New Testament teaches and the Old Testament just tells you stories and other things like that. But I've become fascinated with how effectively major important things are taught through the stories that we are given in the Old Testament. And that's particularly true in the example of the book of Genesis. I managed to download a free copy of Robert Alter's translation of Genesis. He's a prominent Hebrew scholar and decided to do his own translation with commentary, and I've found that really enlightening. So, if there's any great ideas that come out of tonight, it's not me, it's probably from Robert Alter and others that I consulted. And the odd occasional thing that might be just my opinion. Now, tonight I want to be interactive as for the 3 nights. The reason that we are not having a reading tonight is because I think you've all heard the story before and read it probably in detail before. So I want us to actually have a little bit of background. I don't want to spend a long time on this, but going back a little bit to where the story seems to begin. And the story, and I'm not going to talk much about the story of Esau, but the author's transition into this section eventually that ends up being all about Joseph is actually based on the lineage of Esau, which comes before the lineage of Jacob in chapter 36. So, despite not having gained the blessing of Jacob, Esau actually was very blessed by God as well. They both possessed a lot of livestock and both became too great for them to live in the same land, so they parted ways and made sure that they had enough pasture for all of their livestock. And Esau's lineage is mostly a genealogy in the very traditional sense of this person followed by this person followed by another person. Esau moved to the land of Edom and produced many sons, and many of those became chiefs, including one name that we know, which is Amalek. But that's just a name that stuck out in my mind. And they actually had kings long before Israel had human kings. And that's actually spelled out in chapter 36, verse 31, which you don't need to look up. And can anyone see an implication of that statement that Edomites had kings long before Israel had human kings? How could somebody say that?
Emphasis on human, you mean, do you?
No.
Long before.
Long before. So this was actually written long after, when there finally was a king in Israel. To be able to say that, you must have waited to actually then have the first human king. And so I found that fascinating, because that means that even though Moses, I presume, was a big part in the writing of Genesis, there were changes and comments added later by others that showed a knowledge of things hundreds of years later. But Jacob's lineage is really unusual. You might want to double check some of these things if you're following on. There's one point in chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob's lineage indicates that he and his sons lived in Canaan, the land promised to Abram's descendants. However, the lineage is mostly a story. And so instead of actually giving a long list of who begat who, we get largely a record of events. And that's mostly given in chapter, the immediate genealogy is given in chapters 35, verses 23 to 26. Esau's record is all about how his sons settled and took control of the land and expanded their territory. But Jacob's, in contrast, is just his sojournings. And that means he just wandered in a broad range of territory and never owned anything, as we know. It's significant that the lineage of Jacob focuses primarily on Joseph. So the vast majority of what is actually set up as the lineage of Jacob is just literally the story of Joseph's life. And I think that's really significant. It involves essentially 14 chapters. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's more than we have about Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Don't you find that a little bit surprising? So, my first question for you is, what does that tell us about the life of Joseph? To actually devote more time to a single person's story
Moral lessons.
than Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob.
Moral lessons.
Okay, so there's a lot of moral lessons to learn from the life of Joseph. Absolutely true. And hopefully we'll get to see some of those in our 3 weeks together, if you stay that long. Anything else?
A lot of different things must have happened in his life.
Okay, that's certainly true. He had very significant things happening to him. Anything else?
It's important.
It must be important for that degree of emphasis on him.
He became a king essentially in a foreign country where he wasn't a ruler in his lineage.
Yep, he certainly was. Very famous elsewhere, away from his homeland. That's very true. I just think somehow we are being told that there's a great deal for us to learn from the life of Joseph. It's fascinating the way the Bible is written, because it's not a consistent, equal representation view of people in history. So, for example, we find masses of information around King David, even before he's the king, into great detail. Huge amount of detail on the life of Jesus, right down to the point where in the final week we get almost a minute-by-minute blow of what he's doing. And so, God is indicating to us what's really important for us to understand and learn from by simply how much time he gives to those things. It's very worthwhile watching just how much focus we get on certain individuals. And that tells us that those people have a great deal to teach us. So let's start off in chapter 37, if you are following this with your Bibles, because we are introduced to Joseph there. So Joseph is 17 years old when we begin to hear about him. And the word that is used to describe his position is in Hebrew, and I'm not sure how you pronounce that, na'ah, which is supposed to convey the idea of a young apprentice or subordinate learning the role of shepherd from his half-brothers. So that's what he's supposed to be doing, learning from his half-brothers. But the first thing we're told about, second thing I suppose, that we're told about is instead of learning from them, Joseph takes a bad report of his brothers back to his father, choosing to judge their behaviour even though he's younger. And we've got to keep in mind all the way through this story that in Hebrews times that we're talking about, age matters a great deal. And even if you're an older brother, then you have a greater deal of importance, especially, of course, if you're the eldest. So the young are expected to respect their elders, including even their older brothers. Now, this bad report seems to suggest some seriously wrong behaviour, and I guess we probably wouldn't be surprised about that after the atrocious treatment that they gave to the people of Shechem. But what does this bad report infer about Joseph? And that's a question for you. What do you think this tells us about Joseph?
He wanted to see that things were done right.
Okay. Did you all hear that? I must say we've got a microphone in the middle, and I was hoping people would whip out backwards and forwards. But if it's just short, then I'll try and repeat it for those who are online. So we're just being told that Joseph has a real sense of right and wrong. He's very committed to what is right. I am hoping that that microphone will pick up your comments as well. Anything else?
He might have been mindful of his father's business if it was to do with their flock.
Okay.
Looking after them properly would have been important.
So he's focused on doing the right thing by his father and the benefit of the flock. Anything else?
To them it seemed as though he was the favourite and he was the youngest. Usually it was the eldest
Yep.
who was the favourite one.
Yep. And that we're going to spend a bit more time on the fact that he's younger and so on. So, yeah, they probably would be very unhappy with that purely on that basis.
He wasn't afraid to speak out.
Okay. Yes, he's very confident, willing to speak out even against his elders.
David, when you said chapter 37, what was the book of
Genesis.
Genesis? I was trying to sort of think for a minute.
Okay.
David, he might have been a bit self-righteous too, you know.
Does anybody think he was arrogant?
Not sure.
It's.
He was.
Pardon?
I think he was, to a point.
I've got a suspicion that there was a certain degree of arrogance, and we'll probably see some basis for this. It may be that he is a little naive, and we might see some evidence of that in what we read.
But that probably comes from his being the favourite son.
Very likely. Now, the first mention of Joseph may suggest that he was arrogant, telling tales on his brothers, thinking he's better than they are. But another thing to think about is that he didn't think about the impact of his bad report to his father on his own personal relationship with his brothers. Maybe that's just naivety because he's young. But keep in mind that the story of Joseph never condemns him at all. He's put forward as a very righteous man. That doesn't mean that we can't have a bad start and finish very well, and I'm certainly hoping that's the case. For myself, I mean, because, otherwise I wouldn't have a very good record.
Although it doesn't seem to be that the telling tales was the reason for the brothers' hatred of him. It seems in the a little bit later on there, very quickly, they hated him because he was the favoured one.
Yep.
Sort of puts a bad smile on Jacob, really.
Yep.
To have a favourite.
Yep.
You know why he had a favourite, but...
So we probably should get into that. So really, this whole first section, verse 37 from verse 2 to 4, is focusing on the disharmony already that we see in the family of Jacob.
Jacob his father also had favourite wives. This is favourite the generation earlier on.
And that's a point I'm going to come to in a minute. So we'll come back to that because that's, I think, quite important. So, dysfunctional family of the highest order, which I think we'll see and hopefully understand and learn lessons from them. So, this favouritism is confirmed in verse 3 by the statement, Israel loved Joseph more than all of his other sons. And that's actually given or attributed to the fact that Joseph was born in his old age. Now that's interesting because he wasn't in fact the youngest son, and Benjamin was born quite a bit later than that. Anyone like to suggest an alternative basis for why Joseph was the favourite?
Well, I would like to think that Jacob was a pretty learned person and probably God's election.
Okay. You think Jacob saw something that God had character and ability put into Joseph? Certainly plenty of evidence that would support that. Anything else?
He was the firstborn son of his favourite wife.
Yeah, that's, I think, a significant factor. There was a massive difference between how he felt about Rachel compared to the other three wives. All of that is relevant and not a good situation for a cohesive family. So, are you surprised by the favouritism of Jacob towards particularly Joseph, but to some extent later also Benjamin? Why are you not surprised, Kathy?
Well, because Rachel was the wife that he loved the most and
Okay, so he had
for it.
favourite wife?
And Benjamin and Joseph and Benjamin were the product of that relationship. So
Yep. Anything more in his background that might lead to this? Any tussles between Jacob and Esau? Anybody remember of anything of that?
Well, Jacob was very close to his mother.
Yeah.
Yes.
Both parents clearly favoured a different child. Two sons. Esau was the favourite for Isaac, and Rebecca had Jacob as his favourite. Now, how does that get passed on? Well, we just learn what we see in our families. And most of us say, I'm not going to be like my dad or my mum. We're going to be different because we see a better way. But very often, even though we're aware of it, we end up repeating what we have seen in our parents. The way parents behave towards their children makes a huge difference to the next generation, as I'm sure you'd probably agree.
Also, society had this dopey idea that having more than one wife would work, you know. It's stupid to think it would work. One side.
Glutton for punishment, you think?
Well, it's a silly idea.
Okay. It's just a fact, so there's no point in telling him now. It's a bit too late. Right. The classic example of how extreme Jacob gets is that when he thinks that hears that Benjamin, in fact, is left in Egypt, he actually says, you're robbing me of my only son. What does that say to all of the rest of the family?
pretty extreme.
In other words, none of the rest of you matter at all. I've only got one son that matters to me. That is just horrific as far as I'm concerned. Right? So, yeah, he is really playing favourites to an extreme extent. Okay. Now, what's another bit of evidence that he's clearly the favourite?
The coat.
Yes, the highly ornamented coat. It's pretty hard to get much information about this, but apparently there was a similar kind of thing worn by Tamar, the daughter of King David, probably as a sign of her position as a princess. And Robert Alter seems to think that this ornamented, highly colourful tunic is a unisex piece of clothing that could have been for men or women, but indicated a high status for the one who wore it. And it implied, at least in Jacob's eyes, that Joseph was superior in position and honoured above his brothers, which flies in the face of the normal perspective there, where the oldest was always superior in Hebrew culture.
Also, it's signified that might become the family priest.
Okay, for those who didn't hear that online, that may indicate that he was to be the family priest. So, the other thing about a richly ornamented robe, if you just keep wearing it all the time, might tell you about your work. What do you think it might say about the work you might be expected to do or not do?
No dirty work.
No dirty work, exactly. You're not going to... it gives the impression you're not meant to be work. You're the supervisor, the one who tells others what to do, and so it's sending all the wrong messages to his brother. So they now know absolutely without question that Joseph is the favourite son. So much so that they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. They couldn't speak peaceably with him at all. They couldn't talk nicely to him. And the word literally there is without shalom. They couldn't talk to Joseph without any feeling of bitterness or hatred. Clearly damaging the harmony in the family. So I want us to look at some of the dreams in Joseph's life. So you probably know all of this, but if you want to refer to it specifically, Genesis chapter 37, verse 5 to 9. Anyone want to give us a quick recollection of Joseph's dreams?
It was about the sheaves of grain that bowed down before him.
Yep, before his sheaf, I think. Yeah. So, and the second one, which seemed even worse to them, which...
Stars.
Pardon? Yep. The sun, moon and stars, right, all bowed before him. So my big question to you is, where did the dreams come from? In other words, were they from God or were they from his own mind or thoughts or wishes? That's too easy an answer, John, just to say we'll never know. I'm hoping for some evidence in the story that might give us some indications.
Well, it all happened, so it's not something that you could just dream up, I think.
Okay.
In that.
So, that's a very significant thing. If they come to pass, it usually means that God's told us, but there's nothing actually clearly indicating that they were from God. And it's a bit different because up until this point, if you go back to all of the dreams that are listed in Genesis before this, it says explicitly that they came from God. And these ones, it doesn't say that. And so we can't be absolutely sure, I guess.
God's not mentioned anywhere yet through the story.
No. So, I won't go through all of those previous dreams, but it's worth double checking that, reading that, but it certainly was always the case in previous examples in Genesis. Another interesting question is, and we don't know the answer to this, did he ask God for their interpretation at that time, even though we're not told that? Another interesting question, which we won't be able to absolutely be sure about, was were the dreams simply what Joseph hoped would occur in the future? Do you think he had that kind of hope?
I don't know, but it says there in my version that his brothers asked him, do you really think you will rule over us? So they sort of got the message of the dream.
Absolutely.
So did his father, the second one.
Yep. His brothers asked whether Joseph meant to indeed reign over them and indeed rule and have dominion over them, using his own words back at him. And it says that they hated Joseph all the more for his dreams and for his words. So they hated his dreams and his willingness to talk about them. And after having had a negative reaction to the first one, he was still prepared to actually talk about the second one, which to me indicates at the very least some kind of naivety towards human responses.
Even his father was not happy.
Yeah.
But it's a bit like when Mary kept things in her mind, Mary, the mother of Jesus, it says his father kept the matter in mind.
Right. For those at home who didn't hear that, Jacob kept the matter in mind and remembered it much later. Now, do you think that response was strong enough? It was a mild rebuke. Do you think he should have done and said more? I do.
Probably would have if it had been one of the other boys.
Yeah. What we see, and we won't have time to look at this tonight, is that we see Jacob very poor in responding to what's going wrong in his own family. And that comes out particularly in chapter 38, which we're not going to focus on tonight, but we'll hopefully look at briefly maybe on the third night. But yes, his responses are never very strong. And I think that contributes a great deal to the disharmony. If he's not willing to deal with things in his family, then they are only going to fester and get considerably worse, which is exactly what happened.
If Joseph and Benjamin were born in his old age, by the time they're at this age, he'll be, he may be just fed up from having kids around when he's quite a bit older.
It is harder to be a good, strong father when you're older. There's no question of that. But he still had a responsibility, and he perceived that wasn't a wise thing to have been talking about.
He wasn't a wimp. In verse 17, he went after his brethren, even though they had virtually condemned him. He chased them and went to Dothan where they were. And
His father asked him to do that, though.
yeah, well, he wasn't afraid to do that.
No, he wasn't. No, that's certainly true.
In the Acts 7, Stephen gives his speech. All of this is not covered at all, the early parts of Joseph's life. That's just when he did Egypt. And then it says God did this and God did that. And God is heavily underlined.
Yeah, we'll come back to that idea, probably particularly next time, but to some extent later tonight. Basically, what we're told that's crucial in that particular part of the story is that the brothers were jealous of him, of Joseph. Now, jealousy is a dangerous emotion biblically. It basically believes that someone else has got what you ought to have. And it wasn't long before that emotion boils over. I believe that the brothers did deserve better from their father. He should have known and valued all of them. Jealousy is a fruit of the flesh, according to Galatians 5, a catalyst for conflict, according to James, the opposite of love, according to 1 Corinthians 13, and a mark of unbelievers. So the Bible speaks very badly about jealousy, and for Jacob to have allowed that to grow in his family and done little about it is very disappointing. Joseph was probably aware of the negative response of his brothers, certainly to the first dream, but surprisingly he was willing to tell them about the second dream. So, once again, that seems to confirm either his self-absorption or his naivety. It's very significant that Jacob had a second dream. Does anybody know what the significance of having had a second dream that seemed to have the same implication?
You mean Joseph, don't you?
Did I say Jacob? Sorry. I'm glad you corrected me. Joseph had a second dream that seemed to repeat the message of the first.
2 points in a straight line. It makes it two evidence points makes it true.
Anybody remember from further down the track what Joseph says to the two people in jail about their dreams having been repeated twice?
Certainly happened.
Absolutely. It's a confirmation of certainty. So it actually is significant. And that's what Joseph indicated when he was interpreting the dreams for Pharaoh's two servants. Now, chapter 30, we're still in chapter 37, verse 13. Jacob asked Joseph to go from the valley of Hebron, where they currently resided, to Shechem, where his brothers had taken their sheep to find pasture. He wanted Joseph to find his brothers and report on the well-being of them and how the flocks were going. Now, there is a possibility that, in fact, he was a bit worried about having his sons in Shechem Any reason for that?
They'd gone there to massacre the
Yeah.
men of Shechem.
Not too many years prior to that, they had wiped out most of the Shechemites, and they had a very bad reputation in that area. So this is an initial warning of trouble potentially happening, and it seems like the person who's put these stories together, that they give you little hints along the way of what's going to happen. So when you see signs and places where trouble's occurred, then that's a warning sign. Bit of a foreboding, if you like. So verse 18 tells us that Joseph went looking for the brothers, and when couldn't find them at Shechem, he went to Dothan to find them. And the brothers saw him from a distance. That's in verse 18. So how did they recognise him from a distance? By his coat. Now, I am really surprised that he would go on this trip out there, fairly rough terrain. He's gone in his highly ornamented robe. So he's very proud of this, and he's wearing that. And the brothers immediately conspire to kill Joseph. In fact, they said, "Here comes the dream master," or if you like, the Prince of Dreams, which is a strong, sarcastic interpretation of the word dreamer, but indicates that he thinks he's a specialist in interpreting dreams. But the troubling thing is that the brothers' first idea was to kill Joseph and throw him into one of the cisterns. Now, what do you think they had in mind as the outcome of all of that?
They had him out of their life then, and have to worry about him anymore.
Okay. What do you think might happen if you throw someone in a cistern? By the way, cisterns are far too deep to have actually climbed out of on your own.
Drowned, presumably.
Yep. If there's much water in there, and there wasn't always, then you could potentially drown. And what happens if there was no water in there for any length of time? Starve to death. Okay. Robert Alter, the historian and translator that I've been relying on, indicates that this is an attempt to actually prevent him even having a proper burial, which for Jews was a very bad thing. So they planned a cover-up story for their father, which was that a wild animal had eaten him. And then they said sarcastically, "Let's see what will come of his dreams." Now that's an interesting comment to make, because if the dreams were from God, then no plan of men could have got in the way, and his plans would have come to nothing. But clearly God was protecting Joseph. And surprisingly, given that Reuben up until now has had a pretty bad rap from the record that he's not the best elder brother, but in this case he actually does try to do something about it. Without trying to contradict their idea, he comes up with a suggestion to them. So he is trying to create a situation where he can come back later and rescue him. Actually, I think I may have skipped a little bit. He was the first one to contradict the idea that they should strike him, and he urges them to shed no blood. And he says, let's fling him into the pit in this wilderness, hopefully meaning that he wouldn't be killed and therefore he could come back and help. So the brothers stripped his ornamented robe and flung him into an empty cistern. Which is a pretty heartless act. They had no empathy whatsoever for what Joseph was enduring. But then there was a change in events because the brothers, without the presence of Reuben, sat down to have a meal, and they saw a caravan of traders on their way from Gilead to Egypt with spices, balm and myrrh. And so then they come up with a new idea. What's the new idea?
So into the Midianites.
Yep, sell him to the Midianites or Ishmaelites. Now the term Midianites and Ishmaelites apparently was almost interchangeable. That was just an expression for traders that roamed through the land, went to one place and bought things and sold them elsewhere. So what's what's the motive behind Judah's new idea of actually selling him as a slave to these Midianites?
Perhaps that's one better than killing him.
Yeah.
The other one is we get 20 pieces of silver, which could come in handy for a
Yeah.
bit of refreshment on the way home.
And that's not something you can argue with because they actually said that. I haven't got down which verse this is, but Judah said, what is it? 26. What gain is there if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? And according to not just Robert Alter, but other scholars, this is not an attempt to save his life. It's just a way of making money from the sale of their brother. And they appear to be absolutely heartless. It does free them from the guilt of shedding his blood and then having to hide their guilt. Right? And they'd actually said, our hand will not be against him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And the brothers all agreed with the plan. They seem to have given absolutely no concern about not only the impact on Joseph, but also on Jacob. You know, this is going to rip him apart, and it really does. So, when Reuben comes back and finds that he's missing, he rips his clothes in grief and really is distraught. But feels helpless because they've already done that deed. And
legalistic about it, and the teachings of Jesus to have the thoughts without actually doing it is to have done it. So they really did kill him.
yeah, well, in what sense? In their minds, he was being killed.
Jesus would have judged them as being the killers.
And by the way, they then sat down and finished their meal. Yeah, so they didn't have too much of a conscience about it.
They hated him that much, but then because he was their brother, they drew the line at that point of killing him. But
Yeah.
they hated him that much that
They did.
happy
They
to-
hated him that much. And we can understand why that's the case.
It's a strange rationalisation though, isn't it? I won't do this bad thing, but I'll do another bad thing. And that way I'll feel a bit less guilty about it.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Very sad.
And because there were quite a few of them, they would spur each other on in their hatred. It would grow all the more.
And Judah was a leader. They listened to him when maybe they shouldn't have. Now, the plan to cover up his death was to take his ornamented robe and get a kid, right, a young goat, and take the blood and put it on the robe, and hope that the father interprets that as having that Joseph was attacked by a wild animal. And here we actually get a little harping back to the past. Can anybody see a connection with a similar episode?
My brother's keeper.
No. Jacob had himself slaughtered a kid, and Esau's garment, in his deception, pretending to be Esau. And you get little echoes of this all the way through the story of Jacob's life. And I think the message is coming through that his deceitfulness is coming back to bite him. And you'll see more echoes of that if you follow the story through. There's even some strong similarity in the words given. When we're told of Isaac, he says that Isaac did not recognise that it was Jacob when he was deceiving him. And when they come to Jacob, it says that he recognised that this was his son's robe. And so this little trickery about clothing is a harping back, and it's a return of what's happened in the past to him, this time against him. So, when you practice deception, you teach, and your family are aware of it, then you teach others, like your children, to be deceivers as well. So when they got back to Jacob, he rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned for Joseph for a very long time. He refused to be consoled by all his sons and daughters. And the language apparently is just absolutely extravagant mourning. He couldn't be consoled and insisted that he'd be going down mourning his son's death to his grave. Once again, more favouritism that's just going to make it even harder for the brothers. In deliberate contrast, the chapter ends with the word but. And then it says, but Joseph was sold into Egypt, into the hands of Potiphar, a court official. I'm going to finish that part of the story at this point, except to mention that we also get more suffering once Joseph gets down to Egypt. And because I want us to talk about and answer some questions about suffering, can we have a quick reminder of what happened to Joseph in Potiphar's house? And we'll deal with some of this in more detail next time, if you're here. But yeah, anyone like to tell me what happens in Potiphar's house to Joseph?
He was falsely accused of raping.
You've got to slow down. What happened first?
He was promoted.
He was promoted to...
looking after the
Household.
produce of the land.
Yep. In charge of the household affairs of Potiphar, the highest position.
Banking as well.
Yep. Absolutely everything was put into his care. What was the only thing Potiphar had to worry about after that, according to this record?
Wife.
No,
Not the king's wife.
no, just his food and drink.
Oh,
That's,
that was his-
he chose his own food and drink.
All right.
Joseph did everything else, ran all of his business affairs, everything. Looked after, was in charge of all the other servants. But what happened? Now, someone started this? John, sorry?
He was falsely accused of raping Mrs. Potiphar.
Yes. I have a suspicion that Potiphar was a eunuch. So she may have had a difficulty and saw this handsome man as a way out of her distress, but that's all pretty irrelevant. So let's move on to the question of suffering. So, I believe that the Bible has an absolutely unique take on suffering. And I think a lot of lessons come out of the life of Joseph. So, before I ask you some questions, I'm going to tell you a few things I think that we learn. And we'll talk about some more as we go along. First one, the Bible basically says suffering is inevitable. How do you feel about that? Has your experience in life confirmed that? I think it has. If not, you're the lucky one.
Certainly hasn't been confirmed in our life, but during the Jewish involvement, they have been persecuted unbelievably over all these centuries.
Absolutely.
Genesis says in suffering you bring forth children.
Yes. Well, there's probably two reasons for that. One which I don't really know about. So, one thing that we learn is that suffering can be caused by ourselves, by others, by carelessness, but also by deliberate cruelty. So there are lots and lots of sources of suffering. Suffering is primarily because we are imperfect people. Jacob's favouritism caused, or not necessarily caused, but certainly helped lead to the brothers' reaction, and that certainly led to a great deal of suffering for Joseph. One reason that suffering is inevitable is that our desires between one and another clash. Yeah? The modern perspective is that everyone has the right to do exactly what they want and to be whatever they want. If you think about that, that is utterly impossible, because sooner or later what I want is going to contradict what you want and we're going to have a clash. And I think that's unavoidable. That's just one of the consequences of us having our own personal desires that aren't always right or helpful.
I'm staggered down through the ages just how God has almost promoted that suffering by his believers right down through the early centuries. The trouble the believers got into, God was very aware, but I mean you can look at the persecution of the Jews and it's just gone on and no restriction as far as God's concerned.
Yes, and it's true for many believers in Christ as well over the centuries. It certainly is true.
David, you mentioned all the reasons why suffering comes. You didn't mention that God might send suffering.
I didn't, not yet. So let's make it clear. God has actually chosen to use suffering. That was his intention from the Garden of Eden.
Probably can't really say outright that we're allowed to do anything like these days. There's still frameworks around civil society, as the humans would call it. So you can't start to do anything like really.
Yeah, but there's a great deal of push for absolute individual rights, much more than there was 100 years ago. One last little point before I ask you a question. We should notice from this story that some people don't care about the suffering of others. They can live with it quite comfortably, and that's a really sad thing, but it's certainly something we learn. So, in what ways does Joseph give an example of suffering? And you can look beyond what we've covered so far tonight to answer this. In what ways is he an example of suffering?
I think he accepted it as God's will, God's plan for him.
Okay.
So there was acceptance. I'm going to suffer. This trial has come upon me to test me.
He's accepting it from God and not letting it affect his relationship with God. That's a really, really huge thing. He maintains his relationship with God rather than reacting to what God could have controlled. This is a very, very important thing for us. When we start blaming God for things and being angry with him, it really says something about what we expect of God. When we expect things of God for us having lived a good life or obeyed him, it's saying that we think we should have a contractual relationship with God. I do this for you and you have to do that for me. But that isn't the way that God works. And he works by grace and love for us. So we are called on to believe that even in suffering, his love and care for us is still there. And Jacob is an incredible example of that. He went through many, many years of suffering, a great deal of suffering. He doesn't come out of that suffering until he's 30. So ultimately there's about 13 years at different points in his life where the majority of that time is actually suffering. Yes, John?
But David, I don't think we've got any evidence where Joseph says, I'm suffering but I'm not complaining. It only just says God was with him several
Yep.
times. Like, I mean, what you said, Paul, that Joseph accepted the suffering sort of willingly, I don't think we see that in the Bible. I don't think so. Not in words.
Not explicitly stated, but there is no record of him despairing,
Yeah.
and there's no record of him being in anger against God.
There's nothing ever said bad about Joseph through his whole life.
That's right. Now, maybe that's deliberate, but I'm taking that at face value. And when you actually see the way he named his sons later on, God's involved, and I think there's enough indication in Joseph's life that he maintained his confidence in God, despite what he went through.
Do you think the dreams he had as a young boy, as his life went on and things progressed, when he was in Egypt, he had that in the back of his mind that might be what was going to be happening?
Absolutely, because when he came into the situation where he could actually see potential for change, he thought very quickly and behaved appropriately, and that's the story for another night. But yes, I think that's absolutely true, and it may be part of why God gave him those dreams, if they did in fact come from God, which they probably did.
I think you see again too, when he's put in jail, he's quickly promoted to be in charge of the prisoners, because the chief jailer recognised that he was an honest person, and he could leave this man in charge of these prisoners and do whatever he wanted to do. And then again you see Joseph prepared, if you like, to put his life on the line by interpreting the dreams of the baker and the
Butler.
You intimated that Joseph in his early stages was quite immature, and I think God requires a maturity of us and faith that we'll be ready for what he needs us to do, just like he needed Joseph to mature and be ready to be a leader.
That's a very important point. Yeah, I believe God was genuinely training him to save his family. And we'll talk more about this on next week or the week after. It was God training him, preparing him for the very important role that he was going to have to actually preserve the nation of Israel. But we don't have time to talk about that, but I'm really pleased that point has come out. So, and the point about God having been with him, I think Joseph would have recognised that even in the dungeon, he's still given a better deal than other people. And that's through God's blessing.
I think your words, David, are really relevant. A situation that God could have controlled, but he let it go. He let the suffering go.
Difficult to know how to help people who are suffering. I know that in talks at conferences about helping those who are bereaved, never going to say, well, never mind, there's a resurrection.
Yeah, that's right.
And Jacob's boys, they will never mind that. It's some future thing.
Yeah, we can be a bit careless in our way of trying to comfort people. There's one really important way that we learn from the example of Joseph and suffering, and that is his response when he has the opportunity for retribution. What does he do when he has the chance to get back at his brothers?
Forgives.
Absolutely and completely forgives them. That is the major point of the third night. So I don't want to go into that too much now, but that is absolutely amazing. No recriminations, nothing said against his brothers, against his father, against Potiphar or the wife or whatever. And the scriptures actually teach us that it is Christ-like when we suffer and we don't deserve it. Right? It's not cowardice. It's just, it's the courage of faith that, God is with us no matter what. So when we are gracious like Joseph, we demonstrate a powerful example of how the gospel can change us, which is very surprising to most other people. Another thing that's important is that Joseph shows that our suffering may be for the good of others. So it's no point saying, God, why are you letting this happen to me? You know, it may be because he needs us to change and grow, as Leonie was talking about, for the ultimate benefit of a lot of other people. And who's the obvious example of that? Jesus Christ. The ultimate suffering for all of us. So one last question, and then I'll add in a few of my own, but what can we learn from the suffering of Joseph and suffering in general? What can we learn from suffering?
It gives us more inner strength.
Okay, inner strength. Very powerful.
Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ
Yeah.
who strengthens me.
You actually become a stronger person because of struggling and suffering.
Empathy?
Empathy, yes, absolutely. We learn empathy. When we see others who've suffered as we have, we feel for them and we treat them differently than perhaps those who have no idea of what they've been through. So they're another strong one.
Sometimes a person who's suffering can't see God in their life, and they can't.
Absolutely. Some people do not recognise and want to even think about God when they're suffering. Yeah.
Actually, it's very interesting if you look at the Africans, who some of them have suffered terribly, some of them just absolutely don't want to know anything about God ever again, whereas others, their faith grows
Yeah.
strong. It's quite interesting. You see that in life generally too.
And I think, the scriptures show, particularly in Thessalonians, that the future suffering is going to polarise mankind. Those who are fully for God and those who are fully against him. Suffering does tend to do that. Because some people then do start blaming God when they're suffering.
And God may also be testing us as to how we respond to those in our family who are suffering. What are you going to do, Ian?
Yeah, well, it's significant what we do when others that we know and care for are suffering. It's a responsibility. I'm going to rattle off a few and then probably close. We learn that good people suffer. Joseph was a good man and he suffered a great deal for a long time. But the narrator always makes clear that God remembered Joseph. Others forgot him, but God remembered him.
Excuse me, David.
Yes, Ben?
Just going back a little bit, I can't see it quite clearly, but what did Joseph, or how did Joseph know his purposes? What was his God, or did he recognize that God had a purpose for him?
Well,
I can't see it in here.
I believe that he took those dreams to mean that God had a purpose for him.
Yeah, but the dreams, how does he dreams are dreams, right? I mean, I don't know how inspired that dream was. I mean, we all have dreams, some strange ones, and you wake up. But the point I'm saying is, how did he recognize that he was a savior of his people, basically?
We can't be absolutely sure whether he latched onto that, as we talked earlier.
That does come out though, doesn't it, when he's got his brothers with him?
When he talks about it with his brothers, he does.
And at that point, I think he says, I've been saved for this reason.
But I think that's what I was coming to. He recognized it then, basically in those episodes of his life, that yeah, if it wasn't for him, couldn't have saved his household or saved his father.
Yeah. And I believe saved the nation, but more of that in a future time. Another few quick things. Suffering teaches us that we're not in control of our lives. Would you agree with that? We need to learn through suffering the value of obedience, even in suffering, which we get from the example of Jesus. suffering can last a long time, certainly did with Joseph, and can leave permanent scars. But as someone's intimated already, it certainly gives us a lot of time to think things through. And sometimes it takes us 10, 20, 30 years to think through and understand some of what we've actually had to deal with.
I think, sorry, Karen, I think we can also be examples to those around us, and I'm thinking of somebody who I know well, who has suffered an enormous amount in their life, and yet they have maintained a very strong faith and a very good attitude toward that, where I'm not sure that I could, but so, you know, I've learnt a lot from that example. So, you know, whether we realise it or not, the way we react in times of stress and trouble does impact others.
It certainly does. It certainly does. And I think that's a big part of why there's so much of Joseph's life given to us, because it's such a powerful lesson about that. We often don't know what to do while we're suffering. That's one unfortunate thing. But suffering does teach us that we don't have to get our own way, which is part of our human nature to expect. The suffering of Joseph shows that our motives can be misunderstood. We glossed over it a bit, but there's evidence that Joseph telling his brothers about his dreams was because he thought they were genuinely going to be interested in what he was saying. And I didn't stop and talk about those points, but there is evidence there for that. Suffering teaches us that our hope and joy cannot depend on circumstances or people because they're unreliable. We need to depend on God alone, because only He can be trusted completely. And that's brought out in Psalm 16:11. Find hope and joy in God alone. One very well-known benefit of suffering is that it develops character, and we talked a little bit about that. It teaches us to have patience, endurance, and resilience. The story of Joseph makes it clear that God values our character more than our comfort. And we should be pleased about that, but we're not always pleased about it at the time. The Bible teaches us that God always uses suffering for good, even if it's not for our own personal good. That's Romans 8. God will use everything for good. So where is God in all of Joseph's suffering? It's repeated over and over again, but in Potiphar's house, in prison, etc., He is always with him. So no matter how badly he feels, Joseph has God with him and on his side. And I think that the life of Joseph and his suffering shows us that we really don't know how much we need God until He's all that we have. And for those in the depths of despair, they're the ones, if they're going to turn it all to God, will do so. So Joseph's life teaches us it's not all about us. We can't control life. We need God. We can cope with anything when we trust God, and that He is always with us no matter how bad our circumstances are. So think about that in the future. If things in this world get really, really hard for us all, just remember the best is yet to come. Thank you very much for your contributions.